Hi, welcome to PrideCast. I'm Armand Gutierrez, and welcome to the LGBTQA PrideCast here at Cal State San Marcos for the LGBTQA Pride Center. Today with me I have...
Rodger de Andreas.
And today is going to be a really different one. Today we're going to talk to Rodger about... Well, actually, what do you teach normally?
I teach in women's studies, so I teach generally courses on gender and sexuality, men and masculinity, that sort of thing.
And then are you going to be talking to us today about specifically masculinity?
Generally, thought I'd talk about queering masculinity and what that means and what that looks like.
Oh, okay, so I guess let's start. What does that mean?
So if you think about masculinity in American society, it's generally constructed as heterosexual. And so how can we sort of deconstruct that in ways so that both gay identified folks, but also straight identified folks can identify as queer and can kind of deconstruct masculinity in ways that that kind of take the norms of masculinity, the norms associated with masculinity, and kind of turn them on their head. So
okay. So would you say turning it on their head is by like feminizing it or by creating something completely different?
I think it's a both and kind of thing. So one of the things we know about masculinity is that it's traditionally constructed as white, as so hegemonic masculinity, which is sort of the dominant ideas of masculinity, have traditionally been constructed as white and as heterosexual and generally as middle class and that sort of thing. And so anytime that we challenge those notions of masculinity, we could be talking about queering masculinity in some way. So, for example, one thing that we could do is we could talk about how when straight identified guys, for example, dance with another straight identified guy, they're queering masculinity. That ritual of dancing with another guy queers the sense of masculinity because it requires some sense of intimacy that might not be accepted in a traditional sort of hyper-masculine, hegemonic notion of masculinity.
So does that mean there needs to be that sense of romance, so that sense of intimacy, that sexual intimacy that we normally see, or it could be platonic, but it's still technically queering because it's accepting something that we wouldn't consider a norm?
So I think queering is not necessarily tied to sexuality, and that's oftentimes where we get hung up. So when we think about queer, we oftentimes associate queer with something related to sexual orientation or something related to sexuality, and queer just really means non-normative. So, so if we think about queering gender in any way, we're just talking about living outside of sort of how we generally as a society construct norms around how a man is supposed to behave or how a woman is supposed to behave. And so I don't think there has to be any ties to sexuality, but oftentimes, for example, when we see or when we think about a man dancing a slow dance with another man, we automatically make assumptions about sexuality based on that.
Sure.
Or if we take it a step further and we think about, for example, the difference between how society might construct their perceptions of a woman who might have a one-time sexual relationship with another woman, that's oftentimes just perceived as she can retain her heterosexuality, even if she has a one-time or a few-time kind of relationship with another woman, sexual relationship. But the minute a man has one relationship with or one sexual relationship or encounter with another man, he loses his credibility as a heterosexual in our society. So it doesn't matter how many women he sleeps with afterwards. If oftentimes in our society, in our traditional hegemonic hypermasculine constructions of masculinity, the minute he crosses that line, he has lost some credibility as sort of a hegemonic masculine man.
So would you say that men are plagued by these norms of what it means to be masculine?
So I think men are constantly, one of the things that masculinity research talks about is how men are constantly under the scrutiny of other men. And so masculinity becomes sort of this relentless test of having to prove your masculinity to other men. And so I think in that constant quest to prove your masculinity, yes, I think it has impacts on men. I think, some of the early research or some of the research suggests that it has impacts on men's health, obviously, but also just in the quality of the relationships that men can develop with other men, because there's this need to sort of one-up other men or to avoid too much intimacy for fear of how the relationship may be judged or perceived by others.
So the stereotypical macho-ness, obnoxiousness that comes with, like, for example, I have a friend who I'm getting closer and closer with, and she's heterosexual. I'm heterosexual, and the guy that she likes or that she's with keeps on going like, oh, well, what's up with him? Is there something going on between you two? Because her and I communicate to each other frequently.
Right, and if for example you were particularly close to another guy, and then that would even be sort of an upped kind of concern in terms of what's going on with Armand and that other guy.
So I would dance with my coworkers.
Right.
Okay.
So when we talk about queering masculinity, straight men can queer masculinity, but we also can talk about, obviously, women can queer masculinity because masculinity isn't the exclusive domain of male-bodied people. So masculinity can be expressed by women, and so how do women, whether they are lesbian identified or straight identified or bi identified, how do they queer masculinity? And also then, how do gay men express masculinities in ways that challenge sort of the norms of what masculinity is supposed to be all about? And what we know from gay men who try to express masculinity in sort of ways that are outside the sort of society accepted ways of expressing masculinity is that oftentimes gay and queer men or gay men have conflicted relationships with masculinity because they have to figure out how to negotiate sort of this authentic sense of their masculinity with society's expectations, either stereotypes of what they're supposed to be like in terms of gay men. So you're a gay man, you're supposed to like fashion and Madonna and all
Modern
these
Family
things, and and no, I really like football and beer, and so oftentimes what I've heard from gay men who don't live up to the stereotypes is this sort of dilemma around, am I really gay? I don't even questioning their own sexuality in the sense that I'm not finding a place in the gay community for myself.
Sure. Because
my masculinity is expressed so differently than the masculinity of so many people in the community. And so both sort of the traditionally, what we would call traditionally masculine men in the gay community often struggle with the stereotypes of gay masculinity, but also then gender non-conforming gay men. So what people who might be called sissies or gender non-conforming men often struggle with how do we deal with the reactions we get in our larger communities. So oftentimes folks who may be proud, for example, to wear the label sissy, they may even self-identify as a sissy, or they struggle with fitting in both into the gay community, which may say we value masculinity at some level, and may feel like they can't fit into the straight community, who values sort of this hegemonic masculine expression of masculinity. So there's sort of like it's similar to what we oftentimes hear expressed by folks who are biracial and sort of feeling like they can't fit into either part of their racial identity.
Cool. Well, then let's continue exploring that after this brief message.